Welcome to Shadow Fable. Don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy stories that whisper dread into your ear. It started with the antenna. Robert wasn't sure why he'd bothered to adjust it. The box television in the attic was older than his youngest memory, and he hadn't touched it in decades. It had come with the house, tucked in the dusty corner of the attic beside a stack of water-warped TV guides and a rotary phone wrapped in its own coiled cord. The attic was where forgotten things went. Robert, now 72 and widowed, wasn't prone to nostalgia, but the storm had knocked out the internet. So he climbed up the attic ladder, a flashlight wedged beneath his chin, and sat cross-legged in front of the old Zenith. The screen was dark, a dull mirror reflecting a crooked old man and the wooden beams behind him. He turned the dial. Click, static, click, dead air, click. Then something strange. The screen flickered. A low hum buzzed like a trapped fly inside his ears. A picture emerged, grainy black and white footage of a street. Empty, the camera was still. No narration, no music, just the faint whistle of wind through static. Robert leaned in. He waited, watched. 5 full minutes passed. Nothing moved. Then, at once, a figure walked into frame, sideways at first, then turning slowly, stiffly toward the camera. They wore a long coat. Their face wasn't quite right. Not distorted, just unfinished. The footage cut. Robert blinked. The screen went black. He leaned back, trying to recall the channel number he'd stopped on. The dial had no markings left. He turned it slowly, deliberately, but nothing came back. Just fuzz and the low hiss of an empty broadcast spectrum. He told himself it was probably an old emergency channel or something from a local studio left running on a loop. Still, when the power came back on later that night, Robert found himself thinking about the faceless figure. The next evening, after his nightly routine of soup and reruns, he climbed back into the attic. He turned the television on. Static, more static, then flicker. A hallway now. Peeling wallpaper. A timestamp burned into the bottom right corner, blinking 12:01 a.m. No sound but a barely perceptible hum, like the inside of an empty refrigerator. Robert leaned closer. The camera was moving now, slowly gliding down the hallway as though held by unseen hands. A door on the left trembled slightly, as if touched by a breeze, but the air was still. There were no windows. He watched, his breath slowing, his posture rigid, transfixed. Then, another cut. Black screen. He turned the dial again, frustrated, but the footage wouldn't return. That night, Robert dreamt of the hallway, the door that trembled, the hum that grew louder until it vibrated in his teeth. In the dream, he was holding the camera. By the end of the week, the broadcast had become a ritual. He would make tea, go upstairs, and sit before the screen, tuning the dial with surgical precision. The broadcasts were never the same. Sometimes it was a room, sparse furniture, flickering lights, water-stained ceilings. Other times, it was a dark tunnel, concrete walls that seemed to breathe. Always the same humming, sometimes louder, sometimes distant. Always the faceless ones, never directly in frame, but glimpsed in reflections, shadows, or lingering behind corners. Robert began taking notes. He drew crude maps of the hallways he saw. He wrote down the numbers on doors, the timestamps, the angles of shadows. He stopped answering the phone. Neighbors knocked once or twice and then gave up. The real world receded behind the glow of static and grayscale. But it wasn't obsession. No, not exactly. Robert wasn't chasing something. He was being shown something. On the 8th night, the broadcast changed. The screen lit up. But this time the footage was from a street he recognized, his own. Camera angle from across the street, fixed on his front porch. He froze. There was no mistaking the crooked railing, the chipped paint on the steps. At first, the porch was empty. Then, slowly, a figure stepped into frame. The same long coat, the same faceless head. It stood still for 5 minutes, then turned to look directly into the camera, as if acknowledging Robert himself. The screen cut to black. He turned off the TV and backed away, heart punching at his ribs. He slept on the couch that night. Didn't go upstairs, didn't even look toward the attic door. But in his dreams, the hum returned. This time, it had a rhythm. 3 tones. Low, low, high, over and over, like a broken music box echoing in a cement basement. The next day, he noticed something odd in the real world. The streetlight across from his house, the one visible in last night's broadcast, was gone. Not broken. Gone. Just an empty patch of sidewalk, the pole vanished without a trace. He called the city to report it. They told him no such light had ever existed there. Robert knew better. He opened his notebook, flipped through pages of maps and timestamps, and underlined a note he had written 2 nights earlier. Cross-street lamp flickers, 12:07 a.m. The footage had shown the flickering. It had been there, and now it wasn't. Something was changing. Bleeding. Whatever he'd been watching wasn't a recording, it was a window, and it was getting closer. When he turned on the TV that night, there was no static, just the hum, louder than ever. The screen was black, but something flickered faintly in the corner. Movement, almost like shadows passing behind fogged glass. And then, a voice. Not loud, not clear. Just a whisper buried in white noise. He couldn't make out the words, but it was speaking. To him, it repeated. And then again. Each time, it grew clearer. Not a voice at all, not human, but something imitating speech, like it was learning how to talk. He turned it off, sat in silence. The hum remained. Not in the room, not in the air. In his ears, under his skin, he couldn't sleep. The hum wouldn't let him. It vibrated in his bones. A tuning fork struck deep inside his skull. At 3 a.m, he found himself sitting in the attic again, wrapped in a blanket, the television screen cold and black. He didn't touch the dial, didn't need to. The screen turned on by itself. The camera was moving again. Not in a hallway, not in a tunnel, it was in a house. His house. The footage showed his kitchen, the faded linoleum floor, the chipped counter where Margaret used to place her tea mug every morning. Then it shifted, panning slowly into the living room. The camera paused on the armchair where he always sat. Empty. Then the camera turned, as if on cue, and pointed up the staircase, toward the attic, toward him. Robert stood up so fast the chair behind him toppled. He felt breathless, cold, like the room had lost all its air. The camera climbed the stairs step by agonizing step. He stared, heart hammering, as the view moved up, then stopped just before the attic door. Then knock. He jumped, not from the TV, from the attic door behind him. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. He backed away, eyes darting between the door and the screen. On the TV, the view remained still, waiting. Then the door on screen creaked open, and so did the one behind him. No one stood there, nothing entered. But the hum grew louder, no longer a sound, a presence. It slid into the room, unseen but undeniable. His legs buckled. He sank to the floor, clutching his ears. But it wasn't in his ears anymore. It was inside him, a buzzing beneath his thoughts, a voice without words, a language of pressure and vibration, a message meant for something deeper than the mind. He began to weep, not out of fear, out of recognition. It knew him, and he had always known it. The days blurred. He stopped eating, stopped going downstairs. The screen never turned off anymore. Sometimes it showed footage of other houses, empty living rooms, hallways, basements. Sometimes it showed people, always from behind, always watching, never knowing, until they did. He watched a woman in a flower print robe walk past a mirror. When her reflection turned to look at her, she dropped her cup. He watched a child in a raincoat stand motionless in front of a swing set while something behind the fence leaned forward, closer, closer. He watched a man, middle-aged, familiar, step into frame in a dark room. Only after a moment did he realize it was himself. Footage of him in the attic, watching the television. The loop had closed. He didn't remember falling asleep, but when he awoke, the screen was blank. For the first time in days, the hum was gone. He felt emptied. He stood, joints aching, and shuffled toward the attic door. The morning light pierced through the cracks in the wood. It was over. Whatever it was, it had passed. He reached for the light switch. Paused. A sound. Faint. From behind the walls. Not the hum, a whisper. Just one word. Closer. The power went out again that night. The house was silent. Robert sat in the living room, wrapped in his robe, staring at the blank television. Not the one upstairs, the one downstairs. A newer model, flat screen, smart TV. It turned on, no remote, no hands, just a flicker. The hum began, low, low, high. And on the screen, the attic, live feed. Camera slowly turning, toward the trapdoor, toward him. The screen shimmered, and something stepped through. Not out of the screen, out of the space inside it. It had no face, no shape, just angles that didn't belong in this world. It didn't move toward him. It just stood and watched, as if waiting, as if it had always been there, as if it was home. The next morning, the house was empty. Neighbors assumed he'd passed quietly in the night. No signs of struggle, no mess, no Robert. Just a chair, facing a television that played nothing but static. And every so often, if you sat long enough, you might see something move, just past the edge of the frame. Watching, waiting, listening for the hum, low, low, high. The first time it happened, Madeline chalked it up to coincidence. The woman had been pleasant enough, elderly, kind. She sat for Madeline 3 afternoons in a row, sipping lukewarm tea, her skin papery and translucent in the warm studio light. She spoke of her late husband, her love of lilacs, and how her children never visited anymore. Madeline had captured every crinkle in her smile, every weary sag in her shoulders. The portrait was, by all accounts, beautiful. But when she returned to the nursing home 2 weeks later to deliver the finished piece, the room was empty. The nurse at the desk furrowed her brow and checked the file twice. "There's no record of her here," she said. Madeline blinked. "What do you mean? I was just here, room 214. The nurse offered an apologetic shrug. "That room's been vacant for months." Madeline left the facility with the painting wrapped carefully under her arm and a tight knot forming in her chest. That night, she stared at it, propped against the far wall of her studio. The woman's eyes looked a little more hollow than she remembered. Had they always been like that? She didn't paint for a week after that, but time, as it always does, dulled the unease. She told herself it was a clerical error. Maybe the woman had given her a false name. Maybe she'd been moved, discharged, or worse, but surely not erased. People don't just vanish. Still, the second time it happened, denial was harder to muster. Julian Torres was a jazz musician with soft hands and deep laugh lines. He brought his trumpet to the sessions, often playing between breaks while Madeline worked. There was a rhythm to him, a warmth that made her studio feel less cold. He spoke about gigs in smoky basements and his wife, gone 10 years now, whose memory lived in every note he played. The painting came out well. No, it was stunning. His posture was relaxed, eyes half-lidded as though mid-note, lips just brushing the brass. She was proud of it. Proud, and then confused, then alarmed. She sent a message to his email, asking for an address to send the final piece. No reply. She tried again, then called the number he'd written on the back of her sketchbook. This number is not in service. She searched online, nothing. No obituary, no social media, no articles, no mentions. It was as if he'd never existed. The music venue he'd mentioned downtown, closed 5 years ago. The bar where he met his wife, torn down. She stood in front of the painting at midnight, studying it like a stranger. Julian's eyes stared out at her, softer now, maybe sadder. The trumpet in his hands gleamed, but his body seemed a little faded. Not in the pigment, in presence. As though he were disappearing from more than just the world. Madeline didn't sleep that night. She stopped painting portraits for a while, took on landscapes instead, still lifes, safe, inanimate things that couldn't vanish. But the calls kept coming. Friends of friends, acquaintances. A woman from her gym who'd seen her work online. People requesting portraits, drawn to her capturing of the essence. That's what they all said. She needed the money. The commissions kept her afloat. And she couldn't help it. There was a part of her that wanted to try again. Maybe it was all coincidence. Then came Camille, young, vibrant, a little strange. She showed up to her first session with a bouquet of wilted daisies and a notebook full of poems about dying stars and lost twins. She told Madeline she'd always wanted to be immortalized in paint. "I don't want a selfie," she said. "I want to exist." Madeline felt a chill at that, but she nodded and painted. Camille returned 3 times, each session marked by quiet intensity. She stared directly into Madeline's eyes for long stretches, unblinking, almost daring her to see something deeper. Her presence lingered long after she left. The finished painting was haunting. Camille, seated by the window, shadows falling across her face, the daisies in a jar on the sill behind her, browned at the edges. Madeline called her number the next morning, disconnected. She tried Instagram, gone, no trace. Madeline felt her breath catch in her throat. She ran to her studio, nearly knocking over the easel. She stared at the painting, now fully dried. Camille's face looked altered, the mouth slightly parted as if to speak, the eyes glassy, vacant. Madeline turned the canvas to the wall and stepped back. For a long moment, nothing. Then tap. She spun around, no one. Tap again. The sound was coming from inside the walls, behind the canvas. That was ridiculous. She didn't sleep that night either. She considered throwing the painting out. But something inside her resisted. Some thread, invisible but taut, held her back. Instead, she locked the studio and tried to ignore the ever-growing collection of finished portraits, each one depicting someone who, as far as she could tell, no longer existed in any record. She went to the police once, clutching the portrait of Julian in her arms like a shield. "I think something's happened to my subjects," she told the officer. "They're gone. I've looked everywhere. They're just gone." He took the report, nodded, told her to get some rest. The file, she suspected, was never opened. A few nights later, she heard footsteps in the studio. Not creaks, not house-settling noises. Footsteps. She grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs, calling out in a voice far braver than she felt. Nothing answered. But when she opened the door, the smell hit her. Turpentine and something else. Damp, earthy, decay. The portraits were all facing forward again. All of them. Julian, Camille, the old woman. Others she didn't remember painting. The room seemed fuller. She stood frozen, breath shallow. A canvas in the corner shifted, not fell. Shifted, like someone had pushed it. She slammed the door and ran. That night she dreamed of the corridor behind her studio wall, lined with frames and whispering mouths. A hallway of faces, familiar yet wrong. All watching, waiting. She awoke to find a smear of oil paint on her bedsheet, and a sketch she didn't remember drawing on her desk. A man's face, blank eyes. Her hand still smelled like linseed. She hadn't painted in her sleep since art school. Madeline stopped accepting commissions, stopped answering her phone. She covered the mirrors in her apartment and unplugged her Wi-Fi. She left her food to rot and let the light bulbs burn out one by one. Still, they came. In dreams, in the corners of her vision, in faint hums of static behind the silence. The paintings, she began to suspect, were not capturing the subjects. They were keeping them. She tried burning one, Camille's. She carried it to the alley behind her building, soaked it in lighter fluid, and lit a match. The fire roared, high and angry, and then died. The canvas lay in the ash, untouched, not even scorched. When she picked it up, Camille's face was turned slightly to the side, smiling. That was not how she painted it. Madeline screamed, or thought she did. No sound came out. She dropped the canvas and ran. She didn't return home that night, or the next. She stayed in a hotel across town, pacing the floor, biting her nails until they bled. The TV played static. Her phone refused to turn on. The lights flickered even when the power was off. She looked in the bathroom mirror and saw someone else's expression. Madeline took a deep breath and decided to destroy the studio. She'd tear the canvases apart, rip the fabric, smash the frames. She didn't care if it was madness. Whatever this was, it had to end. She returned just before dawn. The street was silent. Her key turned in the lock with a soft click. Inside, the air was thick, like walking into a church after midnight. Sacred, wrong. She flipped the light. The studio was empty. No canvases, no easels, no brushes, just walls, bare, white, pristine, and in the center of the room, an unfinished canvas. Blank. Fresh. Waiting. Madeline stood before it, heart hammering. And then, slowly, almost gently, her hand reached for the brush. Her fingers closed around the handle like it had always belonged to her, as if there was no other choice. The bristles were clean, the paint on the nearby palette untouched, each color arranged in perfect little mounds: ultramarine, burnt sienna, ochre, crimson. The familiar scent of oil and turpentine filled her lungs, sharp and intoxicating. Madeline blinked, disoriented. She didn't remember laying out the palette, didn't remember washing the brush. She didn't even remember buying this particular canvas. It was larger than usual, nearly the size of her bedroom door. She took a step back. The silence was cavernous. Then a voice, soft, low, just behind her ear. "Begin." She turned sharply. No one. But when she looked at the canvas again, a faint outline had appeared. A sketch. A head and shoulders. A jawline. Her jawline. Madeline stumbled back, knocking over a stool. The crash echoed unnaturally loud. No, no, no! This wasn't possible. She reached for a rag, for thinner. Anything to wipe the outline away. But the sketch didn't smear. It didn't react at all. It was under the gesso, beneath the surface, like it had always been there. Her hands trembled. She stared at the painting, willing herself to turn around, to run, to scream, to destroy the thing, but her body wouldn't move. Only her hand. Slowly, inevitably, the brush dipped into the crimson, and the painting began. She watched in horror as her arm moved on its own, guided by something deeper than instinct. The strokes were sure, delicate. She painted her own cheekbone, the curve of her brow, the hollow beneath her throat. Tears streamed down her face, but her hand didn't stop. She was painting herself, not as she saw herself in the mirror, but as if from the outside, as if someone else was watching, capturing her from an impossible angle. She tried to speak, to cry out. Nothing. Her voice was gone. The crimson deepened into shadow. The eyes stared out at her, lifeless, empty. Madeline felt herself receding with every stroke, like her thoughts were getting quieter, further away. The room dimmed around the edges. Her limbs numbed. She wanted to stop. She wanted to stop. But the painting was nearly complete. With one final flick of the brush, her hand signed the corner. The signature trembled slightly, but it was hers. And then she dropped the brush. It hit the floor with a small clink, barely audible. She stood there for a moment longer, eyes locked with the painted ones. And then, darkness. A week later, the building was sold. The new tenant, a quiet man in his 60s, moved in without fanfare. He'd always wanted a studio to pursue his love of painting. The space was perfect. Large windows, high ceilings, that old wood smell he loved. While cleaning out the storage closet, he found a single canvas left behind, tucked in a wooden frame, leaning delicately against the wall. He almost didn't notice it at first. The portrait was striking. A woman seated at an easel, brush in hand, face caught in a strange expression, half fear, half peace. Her eyes were haunting, real. He turned it over, searching for a name. Nothing. Still, something about it pulled him in. That night, he set up the canvas on his new easel. Not to paint over it, no, he couldn't, it felt wrong. Instead, he stood and stared at it, for hours. And when he finally went to bed, the woman's painted eyes followed him into sleep. Just before dawn, he awoke with a strange urge to paint. He'd never been very good, but suddenly his hands felt confident, steady. In the silence of the empty studio, he reached for the brush and began. A face stared back at us from the photograph, pale and silent among our smiles, but none of us had ever seen him before. The reunion had been a long time coming, nearly 15 years in the making. Sarah had insisted, convincing her husband Mark and the extended family that gathering at the old Victorian estate would bring closure to a challenging year. The house stood grandly atop a gentle rise in Vermont, its sprawling grounds now lushly green, freshly scented by the rain. It was a home that had welcomed generations of laughter, tears, and whispered secrets. The family trickled in slowly, cousins and aunts exchanging hugs and updates, children darting through hallways and rooms, chasing echoes and memories alike. Soon, the halls buzzed with warm voices, gentle laughter, and the clink of glasses. Everything felt just as Sarah had imagined, perfectly nostalgic, deeply comforting. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting soft, colorful patterns across the hardwood floors. It was in this golden hour that the family gathered for the traditional group photograph beneath the old oak tree at the property's heart. 30 smiling faces, capturing generations. The moment felt timeless, a memory etched forever. Later that evening, as dusk deepened into velvet darkness and soft lamplight filled the drawing room, Sarah's niece Emily handed around her camera, sharing the photo with each family member. It was Mark who first noticed something amiss. He leaned closer, brows knitted in confusion, and passed the camera to Sarah without a word. Her eyes scanned each familiar face, her smile fading as she reached the edge of the photo. There, half hidden in shadow, was an elderly man, gray-haired, thin-faced, eyes distant and melancholy. "Who's this?" Sarah asked softly, her voice tight. One by one, the family members studied the image, whispers and confusion spreading through the room. No one recognized him. No one remembered seeing him. It was as if he had appeared solely for the photograph, like a ghost slipping silently into the frame. Unease settled quietly over the gathering, dampening spirits and pulling at the corners of their minds. Sarah watched her family with growing discomfort, recognizing a quiet, simmering dread in their eyes. She assured them it must have been a mistake. A neighbor who had wandered onto the grounds, perhaps. But even as she spoke, the words felt hollow, unconvincing. Sleep proved elusive that night. The family retired to bedrooms scattered across the grand old house, but dreams were replaced by quiet whispers behind closed doors, restless shifting in creaking beds, and the soft padding of feet in empty hallways. Sarah rose just after dawn, her nerves brittle with exhaustion. She drifted to the kitchen, hoping coffee and solitude might quiet her unsettled mind. But the kitchen offered no peace. An old photo album lay open on the table, its worn pages brittle and yellowed with age. Her fingertips brushed the edge of a photograph, her breath catching as she turned the album fully into the lamplight. There he was again, the stranger from yesterday's photograph. He appeared younger here, dressed in a suit and tie, standing solemnly among her grandparents and distant relatives. Beneath the picture, a faded inscription read, "Family Reunion, 1963. Sarah's heart raced. Who was this man, and why did no one remember him? Determined, she began quietly digging through old boxes and files stored away in forgotten corners of the house. Hours slipped by unnoticed until at last, buried within a cedar chest in the attic, she found a weathered envelope bearing the faded name, Henry Warden. Inside, yellowed newspaper clippings detailed the mysterious disappearance of Henry Warden in the late summer of 1964, right after that same reunion. He had simply vanished without a trace, never to be spoken of again, as if erased from memory itself. Sarah stared at the photographs accompanying the articles, her pulse drumming. The same sad, distant eyes gazed back at her. Why had her family never spoken of this tragedy? What else had they hidden? As the family rose for breakfast, Sarah gently confronted her parents and relatives, showing them the old clippings and photographs. The response chilled her. Each face went pale, their eyes glazed with a distant confusion, as though trying to recall a forgotten dream. They denied any knowledge of Henry, even while clearly unsettled by his name. It was as though an invisible hand had wiped him clean from their memories. Over the next days, tension coiled itself more tightly around them. Arguments erupted over small things, laughter ceased to fill the house. Family members began leaving earlier than planned, each departure tinged with an uncomfortable urgency. The estate grew emptier, yet no one dared discuss why, as though speaking aloud might give shape to the unnamed dread each felt. Mark, increasingly worried about Sarah's obsession, pleaded gently for her to let it rest, but she couldn't. Sleep evaded her, shadows deepened around her eyes, and she felt Henry's presence pressing ever closer, whispering quietly just beyond hearing, beckoning her to understand. Finally, Sarah returned once more to the attic, desperate for answers. She felt drawn to the cedar chest again, compelled by an urgency she could neither explain nor resist. As she opened it once more, she spotted something she had previously missed: a slender diary hidden beneath layers of old linens. Hands trembling, Sarah turned its pages. The neat handwriting belonged unmistakably to Henry Warden. Each page filled with detailed, emotional entries, describing feelings of alienation, whispered arguments behind closed doors, and subtle rejections by family who refused to acknowledge him. The entries grew darker, lonelier, culminating in one final haunting line: "If they won't acknowledge me in life, perhaps they'll never forget me in death." Her stomach churned. She needed fresh air, space to think clearly. Stepping onto the wide front porch, she inhaled deeply, hoping to calm the storm within. Yet, as twilight settled once more, the figure she'd hoped never to see again stood silently beneath the old oak tree, watching her. Henry Warden's pale eyes glistened with quiet accusation. Sarah's heart seized painfully as she stared back, unable to move or speak. Slowly, Henry turned toward the woods behind the house, beckoning her with a quiet sadness, vanishing into the gathering shadows. Drawn by some irresistible force, Sarah followed him into the dim, whispering woods, heart hammering in her chest. The air grew colder, darker, sounds muted by a weighty silence. She walked blindly, following glimpses of his ghostly form until she reached an overgrown clearing deep within the forest. Henry stood before a shallow depression in the earth. He pointed downward, his expression mournful, pleading. Hesitantly, Sarah knelt and dug her fingers into the soil. Within moments, she uncovered bones, yellowed and brittle with age, a secret long buried, a crime long forgotten. Then it struck her, a horrifying realization that tightened like a noose around her heart. The family knew, perhaps they had always known. Henry hadn't simply vanished. He'd been quietly erased, buried and hidden away by the very people she loved and trusted most. She staggered back, eyes wide with horror. Henry's apparition faded slowly, a quiet, almost peaceful resignation in his gaze, leaving Sarah alone with her terrible truth. Returning to the empty house, Sarah found only silence awaiting her. The family had gone, fleeing their collective guilt or memory, leaving her alone with the legacy they refused to acknowledge. Years later, Sarah still lives in that old Victorian house. Visitors to the town speak of seeing her sometimes, standing silently beneath the oak tree, staring blankly at the woods beyond, as though waiting for someone who would never return. But those who visit rarely come back a second time. They tell of an unsettling feeling, whispers drifting through the halls, shadows at the corners of their vision, and one strange detail that always chills their bones. In the photographs taken there, among the smiling visitors, an elderly man appears, always silent, always watching. They say he's waiting, patiently, for someone else to remember. Picture this. A life once marked by regret and loss, now draped in the eerie weight of memories that may not even be your own. Thomas Carver had never imagined that grief could manifest as a tangible presence. Yet, as he stepped off the bus into the autumn chill of New England, he sensed the pull of something inexplicable. He was a retired history professor, his mind forever steeped in the annals of the past. And now his own history was beginning to feel like a series of fragmented recollections, stitched together by an invisible hand. His late wife, Eleanor, had been his anchor in a turbulent world, and her sudden passing had left behind a silence that spoke louder than any cry. Now, wandering aimlessly, Thomas was drawn to an old town where every corner seemed to whisper echoes of lives lived and lost. The town of Carrow's End, with its narrow, winding streets and time-worn brick facades, appeared to exist on the fringes of memory itself. Thomas's steps were heavy as he approached the local library, a building rumored to hold secrets beyond the dusty pages of its countless tomes. The library's imposing structure, with its tall, arched windows and intricate carvings on the stone exterior, seemed less a repository of literature and more a mausoleum of forgotten stories. It was here that Thomas's journey into the heart of his own fractured recollection would begin. Inside, the library exuded a somber majesty. The faint scent of old paper and leather-bound volumes permeated the air, intermingled with an undercurrent of something ineffable, an aura of lingering sorrow. Thomas moved slowly along the aisles, his fingers trailing over the spines of books as if seeking guidance. It was not long before he discovered a peculiar section that seemed out of place, a collection of journals and diaries bound in faded, cracked leather, none of which bore any clear cataloging. Their entries were dated from decades past, yet some of the handwriting bore an uncanny resemblance to his own meticulous script. At first, Thomas dismissed it as a trick of his troubled mind, a desperate search for any connection to his lost love. But as he leafed through the brittle pages, a chill ran down his spine. The diary of a man named Theodore was filled with vivid accounts of a secret library that appeared only under certain conditions, a place where the boundaries of reality thinned, and where the past was not merely recorded, but relived. Theodore described moments of inexplicable déjà vu, and the overwhelming sensation that time was unwinding like an ancient spool of thread, each unwound strand carrying with it a forgotten memory. The entries spoke of decisions made in moments of despair, of lives altered by forces beyond human comprehension. Thomas felt an uncanny resonance in Theodore's words, a reflection of the disquiet that had gnawed at him since Eleanor's departure. Returning to his modest rented room above a weathered inn, Thomas set the diary on the small wooden desk beside a flickering lamp. Night had descended upon Carrow's End, cloaking the town in shadows and deepening the silence that blanketed every street. The storm outside was a gentle, persistent murmur, a backdrop to the relentless cadence of his thoughts. Thomas began to read aloud, his voice trembling slightly as he recounted Theodore's account of the mysterious library. The more he read, the more the diary's words began to weave themselves into the fabric of his own recollections. Memories that he had long buried, moments of regret, joy, and heartbreak, surged forth with a force that was almost unbearable. In the days that followed, Thomas found himself returning to the library with a compulsion that defied logic. Each visit seemed to peel back layers of his life he had never known were hidden, revealing intimate details of experiences that felt both intimately familiar and utterly alien. He discovered letters tucked between the pages of antique volumes, fragments of conversations that recounted events he had no memory of living. Every new discovery was like a puzzle piece that threatened to complete a picture of his past. A past he now doubted was truly his own. During one particularly stormy afternoon, as rain battered the windows and the wind howled through the deserted corridors of the library, Thomas found a faded photograph wedged behind a row of encyclopedias. The image depicted a younger man and woman, both with eyes that seemed to harbor secrets too deep for words. The man's face bore a striking resemblance to his own, while the woman's gentle smile evoked memories of Eleanor. The photograph was dated decades earlier, in a time Thomas had never experienced. It was as if the relic had been waiting for him, its silent testimony challenging the very nature of his existence. Who was this man in the photograph, and what connection did he have to the library and the uncanny journals? Haunted by questions that echoed in the depths of his mind, Thomas began to document his daily experiences. He scribbled frantically in a battered notebook, noting every sensation, every inexplicable moment of familiarity. At times, the diary entries blurred the lines between past and present, reality and memory. He recalled attending a lecture on American history where, in the midst of discussing long-forgotten events, he experienced a disconcerting sense of being observed by unseen eyes. In another instance, he found himself standing before an old mirror, watching as the reflection in the glass flickered and shifted, momentarily revealing the silhouette of a figure standing behind him. Each incident deepened his conviction that something far more sinister than grief was at play. Slowly, the library became both a sanctuary and a labyrinth, a place where Thomas could confront the elusive fragments of his identity. The pages of Theodore's diary hinted at an occult ritual, a means to rewrite or perhaps reclaim one's lost past. Yet the ritual, described in hushed and cryptic language, was fraught with peril. It spoke of a delicate balance between memory and oblivion, of the risk that the act of remembrance could unmoor one from the very essence of self. Thomas's inner turmoil was palpable as he wrestled with the duality of yearning for connection and fearing the erosion of his present reality. One evening, as Thomas sat in his room with the diary open before him, the wind outside transformed into a mournful wail. Shadows danced along the walls, their movement synchronized with the trembling of his hands as he read a passage that described a doorway, a threshold between the known and the inexplicable. The diary detailed how the door, hidden behind a shelf in the library, could be unlocked only at a moment when the boundary between memory and reality was at its thinnest. Thomas's heart pounded with a mix of trepidation and resolve. He decided then that he must find this hidden doorway, convinced that it held the key to understanding the origins of his mysterious recollections. Guided by a newfound determination, Thomas returned to the library under the cover of a moonless night. The corridors were eerily quiet, the only sound his cautious footsteps echoing against the stone floor. He moved through the labyrinthine stacks until he found himself before a section that seemed to pulse with an inexplicable energy. There, behind a shelf laden with archaic texts, he discovered a narrow, almost imperceptible gap, a door concealed by the weight of forgotten years. With trembling hands, he pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit passage that descended into a subterranean chamber. The chamber was an antechamber of memories, a repository of relics that defied time. Dust motes floated in the stale air as Thomas's eyes adjusted to the gloom. On a pedestal in the center of the room rested a singular ancient book bound in worn, cracked leather. Its cover was embossed with symbols that defied immediate interpretation, evoking both a sense of dread and wonder. The inscriptions, though faded, seemed to shimmer in the flickering light of his torch, as if they were alive with the echoes of untold stories. As he opened the book, Thomas was met with a series of handwritten accounts that chronicled not just his own life, but lives that paralleled his in uncanny ways. The entries spoke of choices made in moments of despair, of love and loss intermingled with the quiet torment of regret. With each word he read, Thomas felt as though the very essence of his soul was being laid bare, exposing vulnerabilities he had long kept hidden. It was then that a revelation struck him, a thought that chilled him to the bone. Perhaps these records were not mere coincidences, but rather a deliberate tapestry woven by forces beyond his understanding, meant to remind him that memory itself was a weighty burden. In the days that followed, the discovery of the hidden chamber and its mysterious book transformed Thomas's life into an unrelenting spiral of introspection and dread. He became increasingly isolated, consumed by the need to reconcile the fragmented pieces of his past with the present that now felt unbearably alien. The familiar sights of Caro's End began to warp under the pressure of his thoughts, as if the town itself were a living canvas upon which his memories were painted in shifting, elusive hues. Then, one evening, as Thomas sat by the window in his modest room, he noticed something that defied explanation. A soft, rhythmic tapping sounded at the door, a cadence that mirrored the pulse of his own racing heart. He opened the door to find no one there, only a small, handwritten note resting on the threshold. In a delicate script, the note read, "To remember is to awaken the truth. Are you ready to face what lies beneath?" The words sent a shiver down his spine, and for a moment, Thomas wondered if the note had been meant for someone else entirely. Yet, deep down, he understood that it was a summons, a final invitation to confront the mystery of his own existence. Haunted by the note, Thomas embarked on one last journey through the labyrinth of the library, retracing his steps to the hidden chamber. In that quiet, subterranean space, the ancient book lay open on the pedestal as if awaiting his return. With a steadying breath, he reached out and turned to the final page. What he found was a single, stark sentence that seemed to encapsulate the entire enigma. Your past is not your own. It is a mosaic of all who have ever remembered. At that moment, the air grew thick with the weight of realization. Every memory, every fleeting thought of Eleanor, and every long-forgotten dream coalesced into a single, inescapable truth. Thomas's mind reeled as he grappled with the revelation that his life was not an isolated tapestry, but rather a shared relic of countless souls, each echoing across the boundaries of time. The burden of remembrance, which he had so desperately sought to understand, now loomed as a spectral presence, an ever-present reminder that the past was an intricate network of intertwined lives, forever bound by the collective weight of memory. As the storm outside subsided and the first hints of dawn began to break, Thomas felt a profound, unsettling calm settle over him. He realized that to live was to bear the weight of all those who had come before, to carry their joys and sorrows like invisible scars upon one's soul. In that quiet, surreal moment, as he gazed at his own reflection in the window, a face etched with lines of loss and newfound understanding, Thomas wondered if there was ever truly a way to escape the relentless tide of remembrance. The final truth, ambiguous and haunting, lingered in the space between what was known and what could never be undone. And so, as the day began to emerge from the long, oppressive night, Thomas was left with one inescapable question. In the intricate dance of memory and identity, who truly remains in control? The one who remembers, or the collective echo of every forgotten soul? The sound of the old clock in the library's tower marked the passing of time in a steady, unyielding rhythm. It was a reminder that every moment was both an end and a beginning, a continuous interplay of presence and absence. In that final, reflective silence, the realization settled in like a shadow at dusk. The weight of remembrance was not a curse to be borne alone, but an eternal, shared legacy that bound all lives in an endless cycle of loss and rediscovery. And with that, the quiet mystery of Caro's end remained unsolved, its lingering echoes a testament to the fragile, elusive nature of identity itself. It begins with a woman who hasn't touched a piano in 20 years, until she hears a melody that no one else can. She's the only one who hears it. And she's not sure if it's saving her or pulling her away. The sound came again at dusk, faint, like the memory of a song. Margot Hale sat upright in the high-backed armchair, one hand frozen mid-stitch above the fabric of a half-finished quilt. Her ears strained. It was there, a fragile piano melody drifting through the wide hallway of the Autumn Pines care residence. Not the kind of jingle you'd hear piped from a visitor's phone or a music therapy session. This was delicate, deliberate, and familiar. But when she asked the night nurse, the young one with the drawn-on eyebrows, the girl just smiled and said, "There's no piano on this floor, Miss Hale. Maybe one of the others has their TV on again." Margot didn't argue. She'd learned not to. They always smiled like that here, like she was glassware that might crack if handled wrong. Still, that night she sat up in bed longer than usual. Listening? It came again the next evening. Louder this time and closer. A series of carefully placed notes, minor chords, faint arpeggios, something like a lullaby, but not quite. It wasn't tuneful. It lingered oddly at the end of each phrase, like the pianist was waiting for her to recognize it. She hadn't played in years, not since she'd walked away from it all. Margot hadn't always been here, of course. She had once been Margot Hale, the concert pianist, trained in Vienna, praised in Chicago, reviewed in the Times as a rare fusion of technical mastery and ghost-like intuition. She'd given all that up when her sister Elaine died in the fire. That was decades ago now, long enough that even the guilt had yellowed around the edges. But something about the melody clawed at that locked door. By the third night, she couldn't ignore it anymore. The halls were quiet past 10. That's when she slipped out, wearing her slippers and that long navy robe that always made her feel like someone's forgotten aunt. She pressed her hand to the wall and walked slowly, feeling each step in her joints. The melody led her, down the corridor, past the framed oil prints of birds and boats, toward the east wing they rarely used. The lights dimmed there at night. It was a part of the building still being evaluated for renovation, the staff said. A place meant to be off limits. But someone had left the door slightly ajar. The music was clearer now. A soft, slow waltz. Not one she remembered by name, but her hands tingled as if they'd once played it. Inside was a rec room, abandoned and musty. Dust hung like smoke in the low light from an emergency bulb. And there, in the center, sat an old upright piano. Its surface was dulled with age. Several of its keys were yellowing. But the lid was open, the bench was pulled back, and no one was there. Yet the music continued, faint but steady. Notes pressed one by one as though moved by unseen fingers. Margot froze. Her breath caught in her chest. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like recognition. Then, just as she stepped closer, the music stopped. Silence bloomed around her, thick and waiting. She didn't tell anyone. Who would she tell? The nurse who kept calling her dearie, Dr. Latimer with his soothing voice and clipboard smiles. Number. She returned to her room, closed the door, and didn't sleep. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and felt something strange, like a thread being pulled loose inside her. The next morning, Margot asked to speak with the director. She asked if they still offered music therapy. "Twice a week," the woman said. "You're always welcome." "I mean real music," Margot replied. "Practice, performance, a piano that listens." The director blinked. "Well, we do have one in storage. The East Wing, actually. Not used in years, but if you're up for it, we could have it tuned." "No need," Margot said. "It's already playing." She didn't wait for the puzzled look. She was already walking away. She visited the piano again that evening. This time, no melody led her. The room was cold, darker than before, but the piano sat just as she'd left it, waiting. Her fingers hovered over the keys, tentative, disbelieving. Then, almost in reflex, they pressed. A single note, then another. The keys were stiff, the action clunky, but the sound it made, oh, how it echoed. Not in the room, but in her mind, like something deep had stirred awake. She played softly, slowly. Each note unlocked something. A shape, a color, a phrase. Then, suddenly, without thinking, she played the melody. The melody, the one she'd been hearing. The one that had led her here. It flowed from her hands like it had been waiting in her bones all this time. When she finished, she turned and found the room wasn't empty. A woman stood in the corner, pale, narrow-shouldered, in a dark gray coat. Eyes too dark to reflect the light. Watching. Margot opened her mouth to speak. The woman blinked once, then vanished. She didn't tell anyone about that either. Over the next week, she returned each night. Each time, she played a little more. Pieces she hadn't touched in years. Some she barely remembered learning, but her fingers knew them. The piano welcomed them. And each time, the woman in the gray coat returned. Closer now. Always silent. Always watching. And Margot felt no fear. Only a strange comfort, like she was finally being seen. But she began to forget other things. Her morning walks, her meal times, her roommate's name. One night, she found herself in the music room without recalling how she'd gotten there. Another time, she woke in bed with dust on her fingertips and no memory of playing. Dr. Latimer noted her confusion, suggested a new medication, something to help the mind rest. She didn't take it because she wasn't confused. Not really. Something was returning to her. Something more important than names or dates or the dull routines of a retirement home. She was beginning to remember the fire. Elaine had been a gifted musician too, but never pursued it. She stayed home, took care of their mother, the house, the little things. Margot went to Vienna. Margot went to Carnegie. Margot got the spotlight. Elaine got the creaky old family home, and then the fire, late November. A forgotten kettle, they said, smoke in the attic. She hadn't made it out. But Margot remembered something else now. They'd argued bitterly over the piano. Elaine had accused her of abandoning the only thing that mattered to them both. Margot had shouted, words meant to wound. She'd slammed the front door and driven back to the city. When the call came the next morning, the house was already ash, and so she stopped playing for 20 years. Now, when she played the melody, the true melody, she remembered Elaine. She remembered her voice, her laughter, her music, and every time she saw the woman in gray, she began to recognize her. Elaine? But Elaine didn't smile. And one night, Margot asked, "Is this what you wanted? To haunt me?" Elaine's eyes were not cruel, but neither were they kind. She raised one hand, pointed toward the piano, then turned and walked through the wall. Margot sat there a long time, the melody still faintly echoing behind her ribs. She didn't sleep that night, or the next. There was a pull now, a sense that each note was drawing something from her, not just memory, but presence, some essential piece of herself. The staff noticed. Her hands trembled more. She drifted in conversation. Dr. Latimer wrote, "Increased cognitive decline" in her file. But Margot felt clearer than she had in years. She began to write the melody down during the day, on the back of menus, paper napkins, whatever she could find. But every time she tried to complete it, the notes slipped away, like trying to trace breath on glass. Until one night, the woman in gray finally spoke. Margot was mid-phrase, her fingers playing almost by instinct now. The melody had taken on a life of its own. That strange, minor rhythm that looped like a question never fully asked. And from behind her, a whisper, barely audible, cut through the chords. "You're almost finished." Margot turned. The room was empty, but the mirror above the unused fireplace showed a reflection. Two women at the piano. She dropped her hands. Elaine stood beside her, paler now, more defined. Her face, older, as if she had aged in parallel all these years. "Why?" Margot whispered. The reflection smiled, but Elaine, real or not, did not. "You never finished it," she said. "Not then. Not before the fire." Margot's breath hitched. "It was ours. I wasn't ready." "No," came the reply. "You were ashamed." Margot looked down. Her fingers twitched against the keys. The final notes hovered in her mind, like birds afraid to land. "If I finish it now," she began. Elaine stepped closer, and this time it wasn't the reflection. "If you finish it now," she said softly, "you'll remember everything. And then you can choose." That night, the melody changed. It expanded, reaching beyond its former limits. It deepened, flourished, minor chords blooming into aching dissonance, then resolving into something almost mournful. Margot wept as she played. Not from fear or sorrow, from recognition. This was their piece. Hers and Elaine's. The one they'd started writing as girls on their grandmother's upright. The one they'd never finished. She had abandoned it after the fire. After she'd buried her sister with no eulogy, no tribute, no song. Until now. As the final note hung in the air, trembling into silence, she closed her eyes and remembered. It wasn't the kettle, it was the argument. Elaine had packed a bag, said she was leaving. "You only come back here to practice," she'd said. "This house isn't your home anymore. I'm not your family." They shouted. Margot had stormed out. But then, on the porch, she'd turned back and seen the lamp, fallen, cracked, sparks near the drapes. She had hesitated, one breath, then another. She had left. She hadn't called the fire department. She told herself she hadn't seen it, told herself it wasn't real. But now she remembered it all. Back in the present, the room was dark, the melody complete, and Margot felt hollowed out, lighter somehow. Elaine stood beside her. No longer a ghost, not angry, not sad, just waiting. "Do I follow you?" Margot asked. Elaine didn't answer, only held out her hand. Margot looked down at her own, spotted, wrinkled, trembling slightly in the still air. She did not take it, not yet. Instead, she turned back to the piano and began to play again. A new melody, one that had never existed before, one filled with memory, but also something else. Forgiveness. As she played, Elaine's figure softened, shimmered, and faded. No vanishing act, no drama, just a final note held in perfect stillness. The next morning, the staff found Margot asleep at the piano. The director made a note in her chart. Patient wandered again, appears confused. But Margot wasn't confused, not anymore. She never spoke of the melody again, never saw Elaine, but every week she returned to the piano, played for an empty room, and every time she finished, she left the bench a little taller, a little steadier, as if something once fractured inside her had been delicately mended, not erased, not forgotten, but whole.